Hey, I am really excited that we were introduced, and I'm even more excited that we're going to have the opportunity to speak with each other in a handful of days about the opportunity for our organizations to collaborate together. But before that call, I wanted to send over this video with myself and Danny, in which we're running through a concept at No Typical Moments that we really believe is really the pillar of success between agency to client. And this is working through a financial forecasting model with their organizations, which is something we do at the onset of our projects. We really believe that goals in digital marketing are our North Star. They're what we can all hold ourselves accountable to. And this is grounded in the financials of your business. So when Danny starts sharing his screen and we go through the financial forecasting model, you'll see that digital marketing is really just one giant math equation when we break it down. And there's a lot of different components at play between what's going on with your Facebook ads, what's going on with your landing page conversion, and what's going on with all of your email sequences and eventual sales conversion rate. So it may sound complex as I'm talking about all these different parts, landing page, email, webinar show up rates, and how they're all connected. But I think you're going to really enjoy this process that Danny walks you through right now. We can elaborate more in our call in a handful of days. And if we decide to work together, you'll see our process in motion. And so I want to hand this off to Danny, who is the individual at No Typical Moments who handles a lot of this financial forecasting modeling with our clients and talking you through our worksheet and the importance of doing this at the onset of projects. So we're really grounded in the finances of your business and making this a mutually beneficial partnership between all parties. So Danny, do you want to start off and share your screen and we can start running through these models?
Sure, definitely. I'm going to do that now. And thanks for having us, and thanks for having me for this. And I'm going to shut off my video just because of internet. So I think the most important part about thinking through an investment in paid advertising, the fundamental truth of that is you're spending dollars with the hope of getting a return. And so on, and part of No Typical Moments methodology is helping clients understand what the future looks like if you do choose to invest in paid advertising and, of course, the agency to help you run the advertising. And so we go through this methodology, which is really about trying to see the future with our numbers. And so we put together a financial forecast at the beginning. Before any dollar is spent, we want to run through this exercise because it's really important to have a shared understanding of how the numbers play out in terms of the overall campaign. And the important part to knowing this is the forecast is not just one that we do at the very beginning of the campaign. It serves as a tool for the ongoing growth of the campaign. So part of our methodology is, yes, let's build a financial forecast up front before any dollar is spent. But after 30, 60 days, let's review the actuals that came in through the campaign compared against the initial forecast to see how close we were to the forecast to the actuals, readjust the forecast for future growth with the new actuals. And now it becomes a even more accurate tool as thinking about ways to utilize your resources and invest dollars to get leads and get sales. So it becomes a really important tool, not only in the beginning of the campaigns, but middle and towards the end and for future growth purposes. So a financial forecast is for you to use. It's yours as a company, whether you continue moving on with No Typical Moments or not. It's something we build for a strategic advantage and for you to think about your numbers. So on screen right here, I want to point out a situation where this is a campaign that will be running a webinar. Right? A webinar is a very common paid advertising campaign that No Typical Moments runs and is very well vested into an understanding of how to run a webinar campaign. But on screen, we want to look at the numbers, right? And And the forecast follows the sequence of events when it comes to a customer's journey. So in gray, highlighted in gray, is a spectrum of ad spend, and we do it on a monthly basis. So we do this, and we go from, usually we start around $1,500 and go all the way up to $30,000. And of course, we can go above $30,000, but that's usually the initial spectrum that we want to be able to evaluate the opportunity at hand for a client. So looking at the ad spectrum highlighted in gray, the first step in the sequence is the creative part of attracting clients to a landing page to, say, convert into or register for a webinar, or convert into a download that would be building authority for the brand. So the first measurement to that is something we call a CPL. CPL stands for cost per lead. And it's really important to understand what range of cost per lead we're getting into, because if you have a high cost per lead, your margins continue to become thinner as you go through the customer journey. So it starts with having an effective and efficient cost per lead. So in this situation, in this scenario, we have determined, just based on benchmarks, that a $3.50 CPL is a manageable CPL. So with a $1,500 ad spend over 30 days, the projected amount of leads your business should be able to get is roughly 430 leads, okay? Now in this situation, from those 430 leads, a strategy that should be considered across campaigns while running a webinar campaign would be inputting something called a tripwire, right? A tripwire is usually a low-cost download that someone can get instantly, and it's usually priced between $7 and $47. It's a quick way to quickly get your money back from the ad spend. And you roughly should be shooting around 15 to 20%, 10%, 20% really is manageable, and something that we should shoot for in terms of KPIs. So playing out this scenario at a conservative level of 10%, out of 429 leads, we should project out that 43 of them will buy a $15 tripwire cost. So as you think about the essentials of your products and what you're trying to do, the acquisition of customers really comes into play here, because you're ultimately building this up for a webinar, which it will be presenting a larger ticket item, something around the 200 to 2,000 mark. But now think of what we did strategically. We've now said 43 of our leads are now customers. They're not just leads. And that's a powerful psychological advantage you just made for your business. So 43 buyers, customers, will now be coming onto a webinar where they're already familiar with purchasing from you. They've already had a good experience purchasing from you, increasing the likelihood that they'll buy more going forward, especially after they hear you on a webinar. So the gross revenue of tripwires will never really be a lot, but again, it's supposed to offset the cost of acquisition and change leads into buyers as fast as possible. But it does contribute to the overall revenue stream. Now, as we move through, the core strategy here is getting people to the webinar. We want to think about a good webinar rate. So a webinar rate that we have established that is a healthy webinar rate and a realistic webinar rate is 40%. So taking 40% from your bulk of 429, 430 people, we can imagine that and assume that we should get 171 leads registered for the upcoming webinar. Now, as you probably have signed up for a webinar yourself as a consumer, you know that you sign up for webinars and forget about it and don't attend. We have to actually put that into the forecast and assume that we're not going to get everyone who registered, who had good intent of registering, actually attend. So we bulk out a 35% attendance rate from a registration. So filtering down the funnel, we go from 171 to down to 60. Now that 60 should be warm leads, ready to understand what you want to teach them on the webinar. Now, this isn't really a video talking about a webinar strategy, so we're going to skip past what to actually do on a webinar to the very end of the metrics. And a good webinar, someone that can really present well and influence buyers and really teaches from an authentic viewpoint, we think for the most part, depending on the price, it varies, but a 10% sales rate immediately live on a webinar is very doable in the grand scheme of things, especially with more and more practice. So assuming that we get a 10% acquisition rate on the live webinar, we can assume we have 60 purchases. And in this fake mock scenario, we're selling a $200 or $197 price ticket. So that's going to give us and boost up our gross revenue. Now, part of a webinar strategy that we would definitely recommend is just because they don't buy on the live webinar doesn't mean they won't buy after the webinar. So having a strong post-webinar sequence sales strategy makes sense, and we've seen it boost sales conversions around the 5% mark. So really, really important to know. Now that gives us a total aggregate of about 15 total purchases of $200. And in this forecast, and as you can see how the metrics start playing down, you can see with Tripwire revenue, we have about $3,500 in gross sales. And then inside the forecast, we want to make sure you're seeing your total marketing costs so we can understand our acquisition costs as well. So we assume about a 3% cost for credit cards for purchasing. Our ad spend, remember, in this scenario is $1,500, and on average, we'll say that the agency fee is $1,500, giving us a total marketing cost of $3,100. Now, on gross revenue of $3,500, we have a net profit of $400. This is an important scenario because it shows, okay, we really made a profit of $408, but it allows us to see the path forward for understanding what our break-even points are. And it also allows us to start seeing how do we establish goals across companies, across our organizations in the partnership that make sense that we're adhering to. And those goals then continue to be modified and advance as we go through. But now we have from the forecast goals that both organizations understand and what we're shooting for, not just to meet, but to beat in terms of growing profits. The one last thing that I know, Andrew, you're going to want to ask some questions, but the one last thing I want to show as we think about forecasting, you'll be presented with multiple variations of the forecast to show if we have a better CPL, what does that mean to profits? If we have a better sales rate, what does that mean to profits? And really have this to play around with and starting to see and envision your return on investment. So we go through a couple different variations based on just the information about the business, about the market, and the competitive landscape to see what our true north is. So with that, I've done a lot of talking, Andrew, about the forecast, talked a lot about the numbers. Is there anything you want to ask or kind of clean up to help our listeners?
Yeah, Danny, I'd love in the variable column if you can sort through the changing of those variables. And I say that because this can even elevate to a pricing conversation. So for instance, we have the Tripwire currently at $15, and a Tripwire tends to be under 50. So we might say, hey, let's start off at 15, but as we're seeing X number of conversions come in at rates that are completely okay, we may actually want to increase that by, $15 or whatnot and make it 30. And maybe Danny, you can show if it increases to $30, how we can play around with these tables and how much of a big impact that makes on revenue.
Yeah, you bring up a great point about pricing. And, once we achieve a certain volume of the Tripwire, I believe it would be a recommendation to the client to continue increasing that price point while trying to keep within a certain percentage. So to your point, if I just, without changing the conversion metric of the Tripwire, if we just go to $30, we remember our original profit was $400. Now look, it's $1,000. Nothing else changed in our scenario other than the price. And you can see how that is just a maximizer of profit at that price. And even more to that point, if we're able to achieve, say, just a 15% conversion, now we're looking at $1,600 profits without changing the webinar, without assuming any other differences in the webinar percentages. Just the Tripwire can prove to be very profitable to the business if the numbers are within KPI and we're achieving the goals and beating the goals that we've set forth. So it's a great question.
One other thing I want to tie up is how this is just one giant math equation, and you can really figure out where the bottleneck is in your campaign. So Danny, if everyone can just take a mental screenshot of what this green line looks like right now, and Danny, let's say the CPL jumps up to $7, so we can show how much of an impact this makes in these columns. So let's say the CPL is 7, where really we think it should be at 3.5. We know as an agency that we're messing up most likely either the targeting or the creatives from a Facebook ad side of things. But once leads are actually in the funnel, everything else is going along really smoothly. And vice versa, we could have leads coming in for $1, but webinar attendance rate could be at 10%. So we know something's off in the funnel in which we're not enrolling people to actually follow through on showing up for the webinar. And this is how it's really just one giant math equation you're trying to crack.
Absolutely. It's a great point because, and this is really another value add to the forecast, because when we just did a 7% or $7 CPL, you can see if we're only spending 1,500, there's a net, right? There's a net negative to that. We lose money. But the reason why we broaden out our spend and see the whole spectrum is because we want to see the path forward. And eventually it does get to a break even and minor profits are claimed. But if we just stopped at the 1,500 mark, we would see that it's super negative and that adjustments need to be made quickly. So just by changing the CPL, it changes everything in terms of profitability. So it's a great point.
And Danny, as someone is watching this, they probably see at the bottom, there's 2 other tabs. At a high level, can you run through some of these other modelings that we do as well? If we're getting even more complicated with this, so everyone who's watching this can see, we can really create financial forecasting from any type of lead gen campaign you're doing from a media buying standpoint online.
Of course, yeah. We just used the example of a webinar, but there's different variations and different campaign strategies. So some clients just come to us and they want to be the agency. They want to use us just as lead gen and talk about just paid traffic. And so we look at it just from a lead gen standpoint where we're just focused highly on CPL, but we know eventually there's going to be a sales page and a cart closing phase. So phase 1 of this shows lead gen, driving in a CPL of $350 and what that means for paid traffic. And then retargeting is a key component to understanding how we boost acquisition. So assuming that once we pick the audience and we get some leads, we're able to retarget them, which counts for warmer traffic. We assume in the variables that the percentages improve because it's not as cold traffic anymore. So you can see as we think about phases in the financial forecasting and how the numbers play out for certain sales. So in this situation, a coach was selling a 4-week evergreen coaching program with a couple upsells. You can see how the retargeting became very profitable. And these were actual numbers, I believe, even through some of the expenses of the agency and the increase in ad spend, because the numbers played out and they were able to determine, I think it's time for us to increase spend because we're getting 2 for 1 from every $1 we spend, we get $2 back, which is, again, another key component to understanding forecasting. So this shows different phases, not just a webinar phase.
And to that point, if you've talked to other agencies, maybe you've dabbled in Facebook ads and you're seeing this variance of $1,000 to $25,000 in monthly ad spend. So we as an agency definitely believe in, especially if you don't have any data, of testing with a small budget, which can be as low as $1,000, maybe max $3,000. And as you can see, we graduate to different levels only if we're hitting our KPI goals. So if at $3,000, we're not creating a profitable funnel for our clients in your organization, we're not going to recommend to jump up in ad spend level. However, on the flip side, if we're doing an amazing job, like in this case, is spending $3,000 and the business is generating over $30,000 in return, it makes sense for everyone involved that we're going to increase that ad spend as high as we can. And as you continue to increase your ad spend, it's not a linear process like this. A lot of times you'll increase it and it will plateau out. And then it's on our team to figure out, why did this plateau out? Do we need to add in new creatives? Is our targeting running flat? And usually once we see it plateau out and we get to the bottleneck of it, we can then continue to jump back up and scale the ad spend as long as the revenue makes sense for your business on the back end.
Yeah, it's a great point. And, before we close down, I know that every, chief marketing officer, every CEO is wondering about, and we didn't address it in the webinar template, but it's here now, and I just want to point it out, is, we talk about cost per lead, we talk about webinar conversions and other KPIs, but at the end of the day, probably the most vital KPI that we want to determine and then track accordingly is our cost per acquisition, right? And there's a couple of ways to look at cost per acquisition. One is with the ad spend only, and one is with all-in marketing costs. So the forecast allows us to see those different metrics to understanding how much does it take for this specific business to acquire a customer, and what does that mean in terms of growth and profit. So cost per customer acquisition is something we definitely take seriously and track across the board in terms of all campaigns. So I think that's it on my end in terms of data and financial forecasts. Andrew, do you have any other questions?
Great. No, I just want to end this with, I'm very excited for our phone call to see if there's an opportunity for our organizations to collaborate, and feel free to reach out to me directly if you watch this video and any questions arose before we speak in a few days. And I will be seeing you shortly.